the biggest beneficiary, unfortunately, in our view, could potentially be Russia's Putin, because the West is actually pretty low on military supplies these days. And it's one thing to allocate money, but of course that money needs to be converted into munitions. And suddenly, if we have a two-front war, and I would say that the support for Israel, just agnostically observing the U.S. domestic political situation, the support for Israel is near universal and bipartisan in the U.S., which necessarily means limited funds and military ammunition and so on might get diverted from the war in Ukraine and prioritized to the war in the Middle East.
Welcome back to Soar Financial, everybody. My name is Kai Hoffman. I'm the @JR Mining guy on Twitter and the CEO of the Soar Financial Group. And here on this channel, we discuss the macro to understand the micro better. Thank you so much for joining us, because we have an exciting discussion lined up today, a timely one as well, unfortunately. And we have Doomberg joining us. He's the #1 creator on the finance substack community. They have 189,000 subscribers, and I'm extremely humbled that he has time for us today to discuss current events, of course, oil prices, natural gas prices, the energy situation in the US. Oh, sorry, not just the US, but Europe, because I'm in Germany. And I had somebody ask me recently, like, what's the energy situation in Europe like these days? And I honestly didn't have a good answer. So I'm hoping Doomberg can explain that one to me a bit better. And of course, we need to discuss what Yellen just recently said in terms of a price cap on oil and how she plans to push that one through. So enough of me. Before I switch over to my guest, quick reminder, hit that subscribe button down there. We really appreciate it, so we can bring guests like Doomberg on more regularly, and guests of or other great guests of caliber, of course, as well. Now, Doomberg, it's great to have you back on. Thank you so much for making the time.
Guy, it's great to be back. I only wish it were under better circumstances, but very, very dangerous times in the world, and frankly scary times. And it's of course it makes for lots of stuff for us to talk about. But as I said, it's just sad that we have to meet under such circumstances. Really disturbing stuff.
Very disturbing, especially if you start to think about how it could sort of spiral out of control rather quickly, especially in the Middle East. So,
yes,
thinking about that, because there's a lot involved. The U.S. is mobilizing its fleet. Iran is on standby. The Lebanon is involved. But I think you can draw a way better picture there. We need to take a look at this, like from a capital market side, from an energy side here, because we need to sort of put some context around it. What does it mean? And I couldn't have found a better guest, to be honest, today to discuss this. Let's start maybe with an overview, Doomberg. Can you put the situation in context for us?
Yeah, sure. And we're debating how to write about this ourselves. It's a very sensitive topic, and we should begin by, of course, condemning the wanton murder of innocent civilians. And it really is sad, the depths to which people will behave against other humans. There's no winners in war, and this is truly a catastrophe on the highest order, and we condemn it in the strongest terms possible. But you're right. On a go-forward basis, you have to sort of try to analyze what this means. I would say we're developing a bit of a theory that not many people are approaching it from this lens that we can see. We go back to the ouster of Kevin McCarthy in the U.S. House, and how really that was the Democrats who decided to let him go. They could have peeled off a few from their caucus to keep him in that chair. He's probably more collaborative and more interested in making deals than whoever it will be that will replace him. And we immediately viewed that as potentially negative for Ukraine. There's a lot of war fatigue in the West. I think the U.S. right is getting a little frustrated with the endless amounts of war support that has been flowing to Ukraine. I don't think that war is going nearly as well as it's being portrayed in the West. And through that lens, then we see this provocation by Hamas. If you view that as an extension of Iran and Iran as an ally of Russia, it is quite timely that war has exploded in the Middle East just ahead of European winter. And the biggest beneficiary, unfortunately, in our view, could potentially be Russia's Putin, because the West is actually pretty low on military supplies these days. And it's one thing to allocate money, but of course that money needs to be converted into munitions. And suddenly, if we have a two-front war, and I would say that the support for Israel, just agnostically observing the U.S. domestic political situation, the support for Israel is near universal and bipartisan in the U.S., which necessarily means limited funds and military ammunition and so on might get diverted from the war in Ukraine and prioritized to the war in the Middle East. And if that happens, it could be a pretty bad outcome for all involved. I think it's but that's the way we're looking at it. We're trying to look at it holistically, because I don't think things like this just don't happen by accident. The nature of the assault by Hamas on Israel looked extraordinarily well coordinated, extremely well armed, very sophisticated, and these are the types of activities that require the backing of sophisticated players. And if this war does spread to Iran, and you have people like Lindsey Graham out saying we should be bombing the Iranian refineries. This talk is very dangerous. We would rather there would be less of it, but it could end up being that this has pretty negative consequences for Ukraine and by extension for Europe. And just this morning, before we hit record, there's news of a pipeline between Finland and Estonia that has allegedly been destroyed or attacked in what is tentatively being described as a probable act of sabotage. So you're starting to see real signs of sort of World War III. I mean, it's kind of hard to believe that that's something we could say. But now you go further. Let's imagine Lindsey Graham gets his way and we bomb Iranian refineries. That oil is predominantly going to China today. And how does China react? And it very quickly could get out of hand. And we fear that that the current slate of Western leaders is I think, ill prepared to handle what's coming. It's I wish I had something better to say, but that's our view.
No, I think you're absolutely right, based just on the reactions, even here in the media. I don't think our chancellor has spoken up publicly yet and addressed it, the situation, right? So at least that I've seen, he might have mentioned like something like smaller, but there wasn't a proper statement. Or from the EU, NATO is involved in the Finland incident. They're supposed to help investigate that as well. But as you said, completely unprepared.
Well, look, when Nord Stream was blown up, regardless of who you think did it, that was a very bad precedent, because if we're going to normalize the preemptive destruction of critical energy choke points, all bets are off for a lot of people, including everybody listening to this podcast. Like, there's no escaping a full-blown war between nuclear superpowers where the energy infrastructure is viewed by both sides as a legitimate target in a escalating series of tit-for-tat counterstrikes, and that's not good. And this is why, of course, you should ponder before you go to war, whether you're truly willing to do what is necessary, and that's why statements like Lindsey Graham's, which can be self-fulfilling if we're not careful. We have yet to see the full scale of the inevitable counterstrike by Israel, and then we have yet to see how the other countries in the Middle East respond to that. Puts Saudi Arabia in a very difficult bind. It all but scuttles the whispers of a mega deal between the U.S., Israel, and Saudi Arabia that may have been, a cause of this action by Hamas. I mean, difficult to try to understand people who are willing to behave in such ways, but nonetheless, it is as geopolitically risky a period as I can remember. Certainly in my adult lifetime, this is a very, very scary time. And as Doomberg, which we sort of have as a cheeky moniker, none of this is welcome news.
No, absolutely not. Have you made out a trigger for the Hamas attack? Any particular reason and timing?
It's really not our expertise, and so I try to, one thing's funny, we've left Twitter a couple of months ago, but when you don't have something particularly interesting to add, it's okay to just not speak and read and listen and try to learn. And so in this case, look, I mean, the decades-long struggle between the Israelis and the Palestinians is the ultimate, impossible not to untie, and it's filled with deep emotions, understandably so. But we don't have any particular expertise to add, and so when we don't, we try not to wade in.
No, fair enough. No, I appreciate your take on this, and as you said, it's a really sobering discussion, and usually quite cheerful here on this podcast. But just having this discussion puts me in a really somber mood. Um, Doomberg, we have to take a look at it from an economic point of view, unfortunately, as well. We're an economic finance podcast, and I know your expertise is in energy. We have to take a look at like the reaction of the oil price as well. Just looking at it, you want to summarize maybe for us a bit of the move in the oil price, especially the sudden drop recently and then the rebound. But the rebound, like one thing I want to maybe discuss as well, it's there's no follow through today. This is only day 2 after the incidents, but I'm a bit surprised there's no follow through in the price action. Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, I think the precipitous fall was driven by whispers of a U.S.-Saudi deal and that they were close. And the price of oil. We wrote a piece recently. The social media for that piece was that the price of oil is what MBS says it is, right? And so when the market was beginning to believe that there was a deal on offer between the U.S. and Saudi Arabia, they concluded that that might mean that the proactive production cuts by OPEC Plus, driven by Saudi Arabia, might be able to, be lifted a little bit. And I would say that I'm surprised by the relatively muted reaction to these events that we see in the oil markets, but I suspect it must be that the market believes odds of true, involving Iran in the war and spreading, to a real World War III type scenario are pretty low. And there is, 1.5 million or so barrels a day of production slack controlled by the Saudis and other OPEC plus countries that could be brought to bear because those were voluntary cuts, of course. And so the market must be under the assumption that MBS will work with the U.S. to make sure that oil prices don't get too much above $90 or $100 a barrel. And I see Brent is just under the $90 mark today. I do think the market is perhaps underpricing that risk, but who are we to judge the wisdom of the markets?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Usually, market is not too bad at forecasting situations, right? But cautious. I'm really cautious. I'm a bit surprised not to see the follow through in price action today, because we're still way below the mid-September highs here in both Brent and crude as well. So
yeah, I concur, and especially if we do see spreading of the war to Iran itself, that would be, I think, a real shock to the markets. The markets just must not believe it. I guess they suspect saner heads will prevail. And look, let's hope the market is right.
Absolutely. That'd be a dream scenario, but it's tough to see that outcome, right? How this all unfolds. There's so many parties and fractions involved. It's tough to sort of unwind that or untangle that web. So we'll have to see. We'll just have to play the cards that were being dealt here, Doomberg. And one question I have in regards to the oil price as well, like Yellen made a statement there, I think it was yesterday, that the U.S. is likely to enforce the $60 price cap. Do you think that has anything to do with the price action in Brent and crude today?
No. So I think, first of all, this headline was a bit misinterpreted for what I could see as I was lurking on Twitter. Because even though we don't participate on Twitter anymore, we still use it as an input of information and news. Yeah. She's talking specifically about the failed attempt to cap Russian oil at $60, and specifically leveraging, any advantages we might have in the insurance market for these cargoes and so on. That effort has failed. In fact, at one point, Russian oil was selling at a premium to Brent. And so I think that's just happy talk by somebody who doesn't know how energy markets work. There's no other way to say it. We said it at the time. It's funny because when this first broke last year, we wrote a pretty scathing piece about how our sanctions policy was destined to fail. And we caught a lot of heat for that. Oh, you're just a pro-Putin puppet, And no, here's a way to defeat the man. And we're doing the opposite of that, and it's going to fail. And sure enough, here we are, a year and a half on, and the sanctions have unabashedly failed. It's just undeniable that our policy was stupid. And when you do stupid things, you get bad outcomes. And that she's still pontificating about this fantasy that somehow, with the stroke of her pen, she could tell India what to pay for Russian crude, is insane. And I don't get it. And this is why, of course, that we are a little bit pessimistic about the capacity of our leaders to play 2 or 3 dimensional chess here, which is what's required. So yeah, it's a scary time.
Yeah, absolutely. No, as you said, you brought India into the mix, but that's where Germany partially is getting its diesel from as well, right? We're getting some refined product out of India. So
Yeah, diesel is being burned in Germany. Those molecules were born in Russia.
yeah,
Let's
and
not kid ourselves.
I was going to say, despite sanctions, as you said, like
Yeah.
not effective at all. So, jumping around, I wouldn't say jumping around, but just logical, like next topic to discuss, since we're on the crude topic, and we brought up Yellen in the U.S. The SPR, the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, has been cause for concern in the U.S. As well. It's not fully replenished yet, or it's not replenished at all after it was sort of dumped on the market. Can you give us an update on what the situation there is as well? And is the U.S. even planning to replenish it?
I don't think it's in a position to do so. You know, there's lots of talk about someday replacing it. Just to give you some numbers, the SPR can hold about 700 million barrels of oil. And at its peak, I think it was like 656, let's say, in 2020, just ahead of COVID. And we've slashed that roughly in half. We're down to 350 million barrels a day. And there's some question in the market about whether or not that's 350 real million barrels of oil that we could actually pump out of those caverns without causing significant damage, and whether or not we might be close to empty. Now, to be fair, the U.S. is a net energy exporter, and the Strategic Petroleum Reserve was envisioned and constructed and filled at a time where American leaders believed that the U.S. had passed peak oil production and were on a terminal decline, and that we needed this reserve. And so it's probably not as critical as some make it out to be, but from a pricing perspective, that's 1 million barrels a day of oil supply from 2022 into the early parts of 2023, and that's no longer there. That the market needs to make up elsewhere, which is why we saw the run up in oil up to the mid 90s when OPEC and Saudi Arabia decided to implement those voluntary cuts. And so, to the extent that we no longer have that tool, and everyone in the world can see the DOE weekly SPR volume reports, we're not going to replenish the SPR. I mean, in what scenario with oil at these levels will there be a sufficient majority in Congress to buy 1 million barrels a day of oil and fill it and just stick it in the ground? The price action would go the other way, of course. If we announced that we would be meaningfully refilling the SPR, you would see that's the equivalent of a production cut, really. And so, and then when prices are low, there's no need, there's no energy crisis. And so, you know, in what scenario would a handout to the big oil companies pass this Congress? Is very, very unlikely.
Interesting, yeah. Peak domestic oil production, I think, like we don't have to talk about this, but the companies have been disincentivized to invest in the U.S. oil production as well. Have you seen that changed at all? Just I don't want to jump down that rabbit hole too much, but
no, I think there's still a fair amount of activity in the Permian, and we have not yet recaptured our pre-COVID highs for production.
To interrupt you real quick, by the way, I saw a newspaper article that Exxon is buying somebody in the Permian.
There's talk in the market about buying Pioneer, which would be a major acquisition. It may have already been announced by the time we publish, but that would, of course, require approval by the Biden administration, and so. But yeah, there's a lot of M&A because you know the high quality wells are sort of running short in supply, and there's a lot of fear in the market that the shale producers, even at these prices, won't be able to increase production enough to offset what is needed. And so really it does come down to the Saudis once again as the swing producers. And the reason why we opened our analysis on the whole Israel situation by going back to Ukraine is whenever Putin has cards to play, energy prices go up. Like that's his weapon, right? And so to the extent that this whole situation is empowering Putin, he has shown in the past that he's willing to play or even overplay his hand. And that's why this news out of Finland is particularly disturbing potentially with this natural gas pipeline being exploded. And so Yeah, the 6 counties in the Texas Permian are responsible for 90% of the growth in oil in the past, 5-6 years. And if we begin to see that production curve really turn over, then I think there would be a bit of panic in the market. But we still haven't seen that yet. U.S., at least according to the government data, which is becoming more and more suspect, I should say, and less believed by market participants for sure. But it has not yet rolled over, and calls that it would have thus far not developed.
Interesting. No, it's an interesting market. I have to admit, like you might have noticed my sort of, I wouldn't say ignorance, but my lack of knowledge in the oil and gas industry. So I always appreciate our conversations here, Doomberg. I always learn something new, right? So it's really, really enlightening. But let's move over from the US over to Europe. And I mentioned it in my intro. A friend asked me the other day, Kai, what's the energy situation in Europe right now? And I was like, quite honestly, he's like, I don't know where we're at. Last year, I remember us having a conversation about gas reserves potentially not being replenished in time, Germany building LNG terminals. But it hasn't really been much talk because we've had a super mild fall so far. Yesterday or today, we have 20 degrees Celsius. I think that's, what is that, 72, 73 Fahrenheit, something like that. But it's been extremely mild, so it hasn't really been a topic of discussion. So I'm curious now, Doomberg, my question to you is, how's the European energy situation looking, and are we going to make it through this winter?
Hopefully, yes. Well, certainly, Europe heads into this winter in far better shape than it did last. And last winter, it got very lucky because it was also unseasonably warm. There's two schools of thought. One is that, with an El Nino developing, that it could be a cold winter in Europe. There's another school of thought that giant volcano, which erupted in Tonga, sent into the atmosphere so much water that we're seeing a pulse of warming around the world, and that could bail Europe out again this winter. And in a perverse way, a little bit of global warming would go a long way right now for Europe. So heading into the winter, the gas storage situation is quite good. Dutch TTF natural gas had been trading around $10 a million BTU. And just to calibrate people, it touched $100 per million BTU intraday during the apex of the crisis last year. And natural gas in the US was trading in the low 250s per million BTU. All of that, of course, was prior to the recent events, including this pipeline in Finland and a few other issues. So now we see, the Dutch TTF contract has crept back up to 15, let's say a 50% rise in the past week off of a smaller base. And even in the US, natural gas is now in the mid threes. And so there's a lot more infrastructure in place to handle LNG imports and to spread them around, which is why, again, this attack in Finland this morning, if it was an attack and the damage was substantial, limits the flexibility to move LNG imported natural gas around, and that might cause a few issues. Now, look, if it's a unseasonably cold winter and the war spreads across the Middle East, and Putin decides to overplay his hand again, we could see some fireworks. But as it stands now, Germany has turned on enough coal plants to potentially make it through.
That was my next topic. So,
yeah.
Which is, and I prepared a graphic for that. Is this one? So, because I had to laugh when I saw that. Apologies for interrupting there, but I just had to laugh.
Yeah, it'd be funny if it wasn't so sad. For all of the hundreds of billions of dollars that Germany has spent on the so-called green energy transition, it is literally coal that is keeping the country afloat. And thankfully, when the country mothballed their coal plants, they did so in a way that made them pretty amenable to restart. And so I think, absent a major geopolitical escalation and absent a really unseasonably cold winter, the continent is in far better shape than it was last year, thankfully. Now, the tactics that were forced to be implemented, the lessons won't be derived from being forced to do these things. In fact, they will view their good fortune as proof of sound strategy, we fear, and they will press on with their foolhardy energy policies until something breaks. Now, I will say, you cannot talk about European energy without talking about European politics, and we are noticing a substantial rightward shift almost everywhere we look in European politics as the deindustrialization of Western Europe accelerates. Standards of living necessarily shrink, We're seeing a rightward tilt, which we have been warning about, by the way. And the recent elections in West Germany were interesting to us. And the big election to watch this week, of course, is in Poland.
Yeah, it's like I'm based in Hessen. We were one of the states that voted last on Sunday as well, and I've been following that very closely because now the right-wing party, the AfD, is second strongest in Bavaria and in Hessen. So both states combined are about 20% of the German population. So it was a mini Bundestagswahl.
Right? And this is not in their base of East Germany, of course. This is in, as you know, sitting there. It's in West Germany, and to see them in the mid to high teens,
I've been checking as well. I was curious where they were strong. I figured, maybe closer to Eastern Germany, as you said, but it's across the board. Like it's every single not community, but not the communities, like the state, and then the communities, like the regions, right? Sure. Every like
county level, I guess.
County, that's the word I was looking for. County, right? Every single county, it's very consistent, 15 to 18%, very consistent, which is really interesting. Just to watch and to sort of monitor as well.
It's not in isolation, of course. This comes on the heels of an election in Slovakia, of course, which didn't quite go NATO's way. And again, let's see what happens in Poland. I think this is going to be a really important outcome as well. And back to the whole Ukraine situation. And so, it's
there's already friction in terms of grain deal and protecting the Polish economy, right?
Yes, and of course the immigration issue and everything else that inflames such passionate discourse. And I think that the European elite in Brussels are beginning to panic. And if the U.S. imagine a situation where, because Kevin McCarthy lost his seat, and let's just say Donald Trump backed Jim Jordan becomes the speaker, and they refuse to fall for the trick of combining Ukrainian support with Israeli support, and they quote must pass deal, but they win and they separate these deals, and Ukraine doesn't get any more funding. Look, it was a disastrous appearance for Zelensky in Canada. I think nobody should underestimate just what a fiasco that was and how that has begun to change some people's minds. And so suddenly, if the U.S. pulls away from Ukraine, believe me, Biden will not pull away from Ukraine, but doesn't mean Biden. We're not led by kings here, and he needs the support of Congress to do anything. And so, just leaving Europe with the Ukrainian situation would be, the worst of all outcomes for Europe, right? They did all this sacrifice, all this suffering, and then still to basically, let's just, take an extreme view, lose the war. That doesn't bode well for the slate of existing leaders that negotiated themselves into this corner.
Well, just the Western world, right? The BRICS sort of separated themselves from everything.
Yeah.
So really interesting. Yeah. The geopolitics of everything, just the overall markets is mind-blowing. I think I have two more graphics prepared real quick. I just want to go print crude I showed you, and that's the energy mix in Germany. Quickly wanted to touch on that as well, because we're importing energy as well, because our own energy is too expensive. And I've taken a German graphic, so apologies for that, because I couldn't find an English one in time for our conversation. This is yesterday's energy mix. 32.5% coal, wind is 25.5%, natural gas 18%, biomass 9.6%, solar 6%, and then hydro is 4%. I'm not sure, like Doomberg, I'm not sure what I'm asking from you here, but just looking at this, like I'm sitting here almost crying, laughing, like looking at this, like, and I think you hinted at the election results, and I think some pragmatism is returning when people see this and hear this. Do you agree? Like, can you put some context around this? Is like I'm trying to understand it and why we went this way.
Sure. First thing to say is that it can be deceptive to look at single day mix charts like this, because wind can go from 25% to 0%.
Sure.
And the other thing I would say is biomass is listed as green in this chart, but in reality, that's burning wood, which is in many ways worse than burning coal.
We had that discussion, I think, before.
Yeah. And so you're really looking at 40% of your slate coming from coal or something dirtier than coal, which of course is why the rest of the world is walking away from their climate commitments. Like the global south is not going to hit their climate commitments, and they're not going to try. They watched what Germany did, and they're no longer listening to what Germany said, and they're going to burn coal. They're going to mine for coal. Doomberg's postulate, which we rolled out in a piece earlier this year, is that every molecule of fossil fuels will be burned by somebody somewhere, and local restrictions only shift who gets the privilege of doing it. We are heading towards another record production for coal in 2023, and every gram of coal that is pulled out of the ground is going to get burned somewhere. And as Germany proved, things get desperate enough, they'll burn unlimited amounts of coal to keep the lights on, and so will everyone else. So why is it that we would expect the 4 or 5 billion people in the global south to do without when the first sign of crisis, Germany retreated back to the coal mines? And so it is a farce. And there is danger in overanalyzing a single day's energy mix. But if you integrate it over time, oh, by the way, the volatility is hard to manage, right? I mean, wind going from 30% to zero and back is not something that can be easily handled either. And the thing on that chart, of course, is the paltry performance of solar, which anybody with a brain could have predicted, because Germany has the solar incidence of Maine, and nobody would, before putting massive solar arrays in Maine. We have a sun belt in the U.S., and that's where we put our solar panels. But I digress. Yes, it's sad. It comes at huge expense, and again, it explains, I think, the reactionary elements in German politics. And it's scary, of course. Germany doesn't exactly have the best history with right-wing politics, but that this is all too predictable.
Well, the pendulum always swings too far left and too far right. Now it's swinging the other way, unfortunately, which is sad to witness, but easy to predict, to be honest. I'm a bit surprised that it went so quickly, though, that it happened so quickly. I figured we'd have a couple more years, to be honest.
Well, and if they get through this winter, the crisis begins to abate. But of course, you still are left with a hollowed out industrial base, and the entire German economy was oriented around and based upon unlimited access to cheap natural gas that they could either sell on to others for a profit or add value through their manufacturing sector. And then that fundamental model is over, and people are angry, and they should be.
Now, especially in the West, the Ruhrpott area, right, Cologne, Düsseldorf, where a lot of heavy industry was, or is still to a degree. Although I think Ford is slashing jobs, and all the steel smelters and are shutting down, zinc smelters as well. I'm just trying to think if we should open one more can of worms here, and that's I think you've written an article about it as well. But Rishi Sunak just walked back his goal of slashing ICE vehicles in the UK by 2035, I believe it was. So it comes back to sort of they're figuring out that some of the goals they've set are not achievable.
Well, in the long run, promising the impossible is guaranteed to set you up to disappoint. And of course, the Great Retreat has begun. It has to begin, and we wrote about this ourselves. The great backpedaling is upon us, and we describe the world between sort of hard right and hard left, and then soft right and soft left. And soft left is retreating from the abyss. The people who are happy to buy an EV and sort out their recycling didn't really sign up for substantial degradations in their standard of living, and they're beginning to see what's really on offer and recoiling quite appropriately and predictably. And so that's just the beginning, of course. And we saw it, of course, with Joe Biden and the release of the SPR, which we talked about earlier. Like, why is he trying to manage down the price of oil? Political consequences, right? And when you manage down the price of oil, you increase demand, which means you are, all things being equal, contributing more carbon emissions to the equation. And so everybody's going to walk away from their emissions, and we're going to roll the dice on climate. And as everybody walks away from their climate commitments, we expect the far left, the true sort of extreme environmentalists, to go absolutely bonkers. And it's going to be quite the spectacle to watch.
Let's see how that one plays out. It's just when realism kicks in. We haven't even talked about the commodity supply side yet as well. But if those goals get walked back, I'm curious what that does to commodity prices, and that is definitely a discussion for our next conversation, perhaps.
You bet.
What it does for lithium, copper, and of course the energy. Doomberg, amazing conversation. I've learned a lot. Thank you so much for putting context around what is going on right now, and trying to provide some perspective, of course, as well. I have your link to the Substack down below, doomberg.substack.com. Anywhere else we can find you, or have you all funneled it now to Substack?
Yeah, we're exclusively on Substack. And look, Kai, I appreciate the conversation. I always think about you when I see news coming out of Germany, and always appreciate the opportunity to come and have such a civilized conversation with an intelligent professional like you. Best of luck with the channel and with the winter coming up, and and really admire your professionalism. You do a great job here, and all the success. May all the success be with you in the years ahead.
Much appreciated. Thank you so much. You're making me blush here. I hope it doesn't come through on camera. So thank you so much, Doomberg, and to everybody else. I truly hope you enjoyed this discussion. I've learned a lot. You might have noticed I was on a bit shaky ground here because I'm no expert in the oil and gas field. And when geopolitics come into the mix, it gets very, very complicated. That's why I invited Doomberg on the channel. Go make sure to follow him. He's the #1 finance Substack writer. Doomberg.substack.com. Make sure to follow him there. Phenomenal insights. You won't find any better. I promise. Better than any of the mainstream channels. A lot of investigative research happening there as well. So make sure to follow him, and it's really worth it. You could just tell by the conversation. And if you haven't done so, by the way, follow our channel here so we can bring guests like Doomberg back on more regularly and engage with us. How do you see things playing out? Really curious. Are you protected for the winter? Have you maybe bought more oil before it jumps higher for the winter, as well as some heating oil? Really curious. Put that in the comments below. Engage with us. Really appreciate you coming on. Thank you so much. We'll be back with more.